always wanted to do that. Can't think of your part of your career. So.
Well,
It's really work.
it's all everybody.
But
Yeah,
long
yeah.
weekend,
Just like,
I'm just like, you guys can't match the craziness here. So whatever it is, I'm here for it.
George, are you good?
Yeah, they had a position that I thought of it, and I kept like, maybe I should go to different like communities.
Saying it's like communications and public
Is it
affairs.
right now?
Something along
Yeah.
those lines. It was like that, but when they explained it, oh, you need lobbyists. Oh, but we don't want lobbyists. They want to do reporting. Okay, I'll do everything.
Oh, so they can share
That's
this.
fine. For anything, not mad at it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, they love that.
Yeah, thank you. I'd say maybe, well, I know. We're good.
shall we? Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Mohammed Tagsar. Good afternoon. And I am Senior Staff Attorney at the ACLU of Southern California, where I work on legislation and litigation in the areas of police accountability, technology, and civil liberties, and protecting the constitutional rights of everyone here in California. So I'm really delighted to be here with all of you this chilly afternoon. For those of you who are joining us virtually, it is quite chilly here in Sacramento. And I think, at least coming from me, I'm from Los Angeles. And I'm delighted actually to moderate what I hope will be an interesting and important conversation with some really tremendous minds that are joining me. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about why we're here, introduce the panelists, and then get into our conversation, and then we'll end with some time for questions, both from those present and perhaps from those that are virtually with us. So to begin, I guess I'll start by sort of saying that I've been thinking about and working on technology policy for quite a few years now. I'm both myself a fan of and a avowed user of consumer technology. I grew up tinkering with computers and making my own PCs and utilizing all the latest and greatest in what sort of technology affords us as kind of lay consumers. At the same time, I am a deep skeptic and critic of the role of technology in public and private life. So at the ACLU, I and my colleagues have been thinking about how technology can both advance and retard civil and human rights in our neighborhoods and in our communities. So I say that to share that I today feel both fear and hope for this world that we're entering into in 2025. Feelings that I think we'll hopefully unpack today through this conversation. I fear that we're in a new moment today that's unlike any others that we've lived through, I think for two reasons. First, there continues to be, I think, a serious appetite for the deployment of sophisticated technology by the public sector, often without without thought to the human impacts and costs of that technology. And the second reason is, as I'm sure you all are aware, we're facing a national government led by the Trump administration and its techno-billionaire allies that really has a voracious appetite for the fruits of that same technological innovation. So that's what I fear. But at the same time, I actually feel quite a bit of hope in this moment. Again, one that perhaps is unlike the feelings of hope that I felt before. And that again is for two reasons. One is that there, I think, continues to be, from my vantage point, really sort of latent and emerging popular community interest in how technology impacts people's everyday life. Sort of unlike what I remember from 10 or 15 years ago. So that's number one. And number two is I think there appears to be certainly from not just from the kind of the popular grassroots level, but from the level of stakeholders and policymakers, a budding bipartisan interest in tackling some of these problems. Certainly that's true here in California. And so to me, we have these two headwinds that are coming together, and I hope what we'll be able to do today is talk a little bit about them and sort of unpack this particular moment. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit with my colleagues on this panel about what technological trends worry us today. How might the Trump administration and other actors exploit those technological trends in harmful ways? And finally, what we can do to stop that. So that's our agenda for this afternoon. So let me briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll get to our conversation. So first, I'm going to start, furthest away from me, is Hayley Tsukayama, who is an Associate Director of Legislative Activism at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. That's an organization that promotes civil and human rights in the digital world. She focuses on state legislation for the organization. Actually, much of her work is here in California. And she works on issues like surveillance and consumer privacy. And prior to her time at EFF, Hayley was a technology reporter for the Washington Post. Next to Hayley is Mike Derman, who's a fellow at the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. The Brennan Center is a nonprofit policy and research institute based out of New York University. And relevant to our conversation, Mike and his colleagues work to ensure that the US government respects human rights and fundamental freedoms in how it prosecutes its sort of national security and counterterrorism policy. And prior to joining Brennan, Mike had a 16-year career in federal law enforcement. Finally, to my immediate right is Chauncey Smith. Chauncey is an associate director of the Reimagine Justice and Safety Program at Catalyst, California. That's a nonprofit advocacy and research organization that, among other goals, promotes racial justice across all walks of life here in California. So Chauncey works in partnership with community-based organizations and government stakeholders to reform and indeed change California's criminal legal system in ways that would make California communities safer, especially for low-income people of color. Chauncey currently serves, in addition to that role, as an appointee of the Attorney General here in California, Rob Bonta, to California's Racial and Identity Profiling Act Advisory Board. So those are our panelists. I'm excited to sort of get into it with them. So maybe what I'll do is sort of start the conversation by level setting a little bit to talk about some of these technologies that give me at least a little bit of heartburn. So what I might do, sort of suggest is, I think we all know that some of these technologies and indeed forms of mass surveillance are all around us, some that we are aware of and cognizant of, and others that we might not be. So perhaps I'll start with you, Hayley. What keeps you up at night? And what of these technologies do you kind of and your colleagues think about, and how are these sort of technological capabilities coming up in the legislature?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me, and asking me to come share my nightmares. I appreciate that. As you said, there are honestly so many technologies that I think about. I've been at this nearly 7 years. Before that, as you say, I was a reporter, and it's really been an education. There are so many things I wish I knew as a reporter that I know now. But I think specifically when I think about what keeps me up at night, police use of all kinds of specific technologies. So face and biometric recognition, robots with weaponry on them, automated license plate readers, gunshot detection technologies. These are debates we've all seen come up in legislatures really across the country. And sometimes they're bills to kind of further and ease the use of these technologies. Sometimes we do see bills to try and rein things in. Sometimes we see bills to try and set kind of minimum standards that often are not actually sufficient to address the concerns and the problems that these technologies raise. And then, as technology evolves, so too do we see new bills come up. So increasingly also seeing emerging conversations about, for example, AI use in police work. So using AI to, for example, write police reports. So that's just like a quick list of my nightmares. But why are they nightmares? Like, why do they keep me up at night? I think in a lot of cases, particularly when we see these come up in the legislature, I am worried that they're seen, either as an unalloyed good or a necessary tool, right? So it's like, oh, well, what are the trade-offs? If it's public safety, then maybe we don't really need to worry about privacy. And I'm certainly not suggesting that these technologies themselves are evil. Like, that's actually not a framing that I find particularly helpful. But I think it's always worth taking a beat when we're thinking about new tools and new technologies, because in many cases, these are technologies that are in some way undermining or streamlining a process. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't say due process, but a process, because in that effort to kind of make things go more smoothly or to make things more efficient, they introduce a lot of shortcuts and biases that can undercut really the fairness of an investigation, or certainly at least the way that the checks and balances that we've built into the system to make sure that these things are fair. Like any tool, they aren't perfect. They can introduce errors, they have their own weaknesses, and where we run into specific trouble is if we are using these tools without taking the time to really educate the people who are using them and educate the people who they are used on about those errors and those weaknesses. I think also often with new technologies, people kind of think, oh, this is great, like this is a new tool, it's going to be infallible, right? Like this is a tool that I can totally trust to make this decision for me. And I think we all know that that's just not the case, right? If you look at error rates on things like face recognition, especially around certain populations, you know, that's just not the case. So it might be a tool that you have in the toolbox, well, not face recognition, but other tools you might have in the toolbox. But you have to be aware of what those weaknesses are. I think, you know, if you're just a normal person and you're researching, like, is this a product I want to buy, right? You're like looking at pros and cons. You're trying to figure out how fit a tool is for the purpose that you want to use it. And that is definitely something that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about these technologies. And of course, when we're thinking about surveillance, it's not always like about actual specific like a new tech that we're thinking about. For example, like community surveillance apps we do a lot of work on. These are apps like Citizen or Neighbors. Like those are people that share information. Those are apps that share information with police, but they are essentially, you know, just reports like from people who've seen stuff in their neighborhood. Like how are those things vetted? I know we'll get to information sharing later, but if you ask me what actually like keeps me up at night, it is sort of that sharing that keeps me up at night. Because it can be so pervasive and easy. It's so easy to share information in ways that people don't expect. But it can be very hard to explain to people why data collection and data use is a problem, because it can feel like a very neutral thing. I think when people think surveillance, there's some intention behind that, right, to monitor, but actually the surveillance apparatus is much bigger than that. It can use a lot of different things to plug into surveillance.
Got it. I appreciate that, Hayley. Let me sort of follow up with you on that, and then maybe I'll ask my the other panelists to chime in. So I mean, so you've raised these sort of nightmares and these horrors, and I guess the natural response, I would imagine, from the purveyors of that technology or the consumers of this technology that is giving you heartburn is, look, we need this tech. Like, this is important for us. You know, for instance, the police might say, look, you know, down in Los Angeles, we have the Olympics coming up. We have, you know, the World Cup is coming. We have these mass events that are planned here in the state of California. These tools and these technologies are important to maintaining sort of public safety. So given that kind of justification, what kind of criteria might you think about in assessing the kind of legitimacy of that claim?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear from you on this as well. But I think, you know, in a lot of cases, it's making sure that we're interrogating the claims that are made by these products, and so making sure that they're actually effective in the way that they're being used, and then really trying to talk with the community to make sure that, like, okay, this is the benefit, this is the cost, right? Both in terms of, in terms of harms, right? And just sort of making sure that we have a place for that conversation so that you can make an informed decision, right? That it's not just somebody saying, hey, I've got this magic thing that you can plug in. Yeah.
Chelsea, any thoughts about that?
Hi everyone, I'm Mike German with the Brennan Center. In my career, my 16-year career as a federal law enforcement officer, I was an FBI agent, some of which was spent here in in California and Los Angeles. Obviously, law enforcement has tremendous powers, both to collect information, to conduct investigations, to conduct surveillance, for the purpose of criminal justice. And in using those powers, what we've known throughout history is that those powers are very easily abused, right? The FBI has a long history of using its investigative authorities to target specific populations, particularly to target activists who are agitating for social change, viewing them not as a challenge to the social system, but rather a threat to security. So in the 1970s and 80s, a number of reforms were put in place, specifically designed to make sure that law enforcement was focused on criminal violations. And in the FBI, they created Attorney General guidelines that required a reasonable indication of criminal activity to justify an investigation. It sounds like it might be hard, but it's not, because they're using the basis of a reasonably prudent law enforcement officer's concept of what information would give them suspicion that some federal crime could be occurring in the future. right? It's a pretty low standard, as I used to tell young FBI agents, you know, if you can't write down on a piece of paper why you think this person is committing some kind of crime, you know, you better find somebody else. There's a lot of other bad people out there, right? That this is a pretty reasonable standard, right in the name. That was also true for state and local law enforcement. You might remember the red squads from back in the day where law enforcement agencies where you had a intelligence squad that was used for political policing, not just of activists, but of other legislators and politicians. So the federal government created a regulation, 28 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 23, that required a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. That was a standard that the law enforcement intelligence units supported because it's actually helpful, and this is what I found out in my job, that I did undercover work against neo-Nazis. All of them were scary to me. All of them were saying things that sounded very dangerous to me. But the discipline of having to document evidence that gave me a reasonable indication that they were committing a crime helped me focus that investigation properly. Unfortunately, after 9/11, this concept of information sharing became very prevalent. And you know, the idea that all information is important, that's what created a lot of these social media monitoring programs. It created in the federal system the Patriot Act, Section 215, that collected all of our telephone metadata. But it's actually not true that all information can be helpful, right? It's not helpful if it's not accurate. And unfortunately, a lot of the information that gets collected in these new systems isn't accurate, and it's not helpful if it's not timely. And that's what the Code of Federal Regulations did, because it required a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity to justify collecting the information, or retaining it, or disseminating it. So at every stage, you had to make this determination. This was reasonably indicative of some kind of criminal activity. Moreover, there was a 5-year limitation on retention, that unless you could reauthorize that as reasonably suspicious of criminal activity, you would purge it. So this data wouldn't just be sitting there for whatever purpose some other entity might make of it. But unfortunately, those standards were undermined. I don't know if you want to talk about those systems now.
No, I please.
Okay. So in the post 9/11 environment with it, information sharing is ubiquitous. There are a number of different platforms for sharing information. This includes virtual platforms. There's the Index, Linux, RIS, Law Enforcement Online. All these are different systems run by different agencies, many by the FBI, Justice Department, also the Homeland Security Information Network. So these are virtual systems for sharing information, but there are also platforms. So the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force is one of the primary platforms that the FBI uses. They recruit members from state and local law enforcement and other federal agencies who all work together in the same room. In joining a Joint Terrorism Task Force, a state or local officer is deputized as a federal officer, right? So it's a system where we know one set of rules apply. The federal government's rules, the FBI's rules apply to everyone working in that, whether they're a state officer, a local officer, or another federal officer from another region. But they also created a parallel system called the National Network of Fusion Centers. And fusion centers exist in a regulatory gray area, right? These are sometimes state agencies, sometimes they're regional agencies. California has 6 of these, and they're set up as law enforcement intelligence sharing hubs. But they include more than just law enforcement. They include emergency responders, they include public health officials, they include private entities, often undisclosed private entities. So private companies have people in these same rooms sharing information that's being collected about California residents in a particularly unregulated environment. So When I worked at the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office for a number of years, and we did some of the first reporting on these centers, and we called it policy washing, where if a local agency had a standard that was a little bit higher than the FBI standard, well, the FBI is right there, so we'll use the FBI standard for collecting and sharing information. If a state standard is higher in one state but lower in another, we'll use the other state's fusion center to collect the information and then just share it through these multitude of networks. So and the federal government will say, well, sure, we provide resources and we put FBI and Homeland Security agents in these centers and give them access to our information, but it's not ours. If you have a problem, that's not us. That's the state entity that controls it. But if you go to state legislatures, and just how many people have heard of fusion centers? So you guys are on top of it. You know, but many places we go, and the state says we don't have any way to regulate these. You know, we don't have any investigative agencies that can go in and examine what they're doing and what they're sharing. And these centers are particularly problematic because they created a separate information collection and sharing system called suspicious activity reporting, which sounds a lot like that 28 CFR Part 23 standard of reasonable suspicion, right? But they're not. In fact, when they set up the standards, they intentionally lowered the standards so that it was below reasonable suspicion. And they'll often say, well, our fusion center complies with 28 CFR Part 23. But the trick is, they don't think 28 CFR Part 23 applies to suspicious activity reports, right? So it becomes this gray area. And again, when I was with the ACLU of Northern California collected some of these SARS California fusion centers, and not just collecting information about people who are engaged in innocuous activities, like photographers were often stopped and their information collected, but also targeted. We saw a lot of things that suspicious activity was only suspicious because of the description of the person being a Middle Eastern male, for example. There was one that I remember just because it really stood out, that a Middle Eastern male who had purchased a large quantity of water was part of it, you know, did domestic terrorism work, but I'm not sure if they thought that drowning was a terrorist. You know, that it sounds absurd, except that information was put into a criminal intelligence system shared with the federal government. So, you know, again, because Federal Department of Homeland Security is in these fusion centers, you know, how that information could be shared with immigration agents and other information where it's in this unregulated environment where, you know, even if you're monitoring all these different sets, if I'm sitting next to somebody from the Department of Homeland Security, I can easily pass that information over to them without any kind of oversight or compliance with sitting standards. So,
No, I appreciate that, Mike. It sounds to me like, you know, one of the things that Hayley, you talked about was that, you know, the technologies themselves may inherently be problematic. They may not be, but they could be. But that one of your real concerns is the sharing of the information that's created or generated by these technologies. And I think what, Mike, you're describing is sort of an architecture of sharing that, to my mind, has like three, or at least you've identified three fundamental problems. You know, one, it's they're often unregulated. They live in this sort of like legal gray area. The second is that the fruits of their work, like the suspicious activity reports, are created at a standard that's much lower than what might be sort of traditional gumshoe detective work. And then third, there's, as a result, a kind of race to the bottom when it comes to the who in these like cooperating sort of police agencies get whose standard wins, or like whose protocols win. So I guess all of that, it sounds like structurally quite problematic. But then I guess my follow-up question for you, Mike, is, well, what then happens when you have an executive branch that is one that itself has questionable fealty to legal rules, and it has a predisposition towards exploiting the kinds of information that you're talking about in ways that we might all consider in this room to be quite nefarious. How do you think about this system put in the hands of the particular folks that are in charge of the national government today?
It's quite dangerous, particularly when you have some states enacting laws, say abortion-related laws. So something that might, 2 years ago not have been considered a crime is now a crime in one state where it's not a crime in another state. So the collection standard being around the idea of sharing law enforcement information allows these centers that again are working with private entities and private companies, data aggregators, social media monitoring companies, that the type of information that's collected just from the daily activities of California residents that have nothing to do with any criminal activity could be shared in a network that shares with these other states that might use that information in a way that we wouldn't want them to use, that law enforcement in the United States would be prohibited from using, or I'm sorry, law enforcement in California would be prohibited from using. So, whether it's immigration or abortion-related or protest activities, right? We had it during the first Trump administration, a Department of Homeland Security intelligence official came public saying, my political bosses at the Department of Homeland Security told me to suppress reports of white supremacists and far-right militant violence, and instead amplify reports of anti-fascist violence, right? That we had politicized the intelligence in a way that it wasn't about protecting public safety, it was about creating an image that justified some of the political rhetoric that the Trump administration was pushing. So they have such an ability, the law enforcement has such an ability to act in secret in a way that we can't know how that information being collected is used. And it's not just that we want to protect the privacy and civil liberties of California residents. As a former law enforcement officer, all that information in there that's not timely, that's not relevant to criminal activities, that's inaccurate, is dangerous because it makes the systems unreliable. And I'll say, one of the fascinating things about the attack on the January 6th, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol is the network of fusion centers had a meeting where they wanted to warn the Capitol Police about what they were seeing in the network about far-right militants acting. But the federal government didn't react to that, and my belief, based on what I know about the inaccuracy in fusion center reports around the country, is that system isn't reliable, so nobody listens to it. And that even when they do get something right and report it in a timely way, it's like the kid who cried wolf, right? It's not going to be taken seriously because they're warning about all kinds of false threats as well.
Got it. So Johnson, let me kind of move over to you. I mean, I think what given what Mike is talking about with respect to how we might not trust this particular federal administration with the fruits of all of the data that Hayley was describing, one might respond and say, well, okay, that's the federal government, but we're different here in California. Law enforcement agencies, police departments here in California don't have to, don't deprioritize, right-wing violence. They're much better, or you could trust us, they might say. Give us these same tools. We would like to address, for instance, the supposed crime wave that's been hitting California the last few years. So that would, the response, I think, to Mike would be, we're different here in California. So I guess my question for you is that true? When we hear that police departments across the state of California need to use these technologies and will use those technologies in ways that are actually fundamentally different or much better for the state of California, what do you say in response to those claims?
Thank you for that question, Mohammed. Very grateful to be here and to speak with folks about these very important issues. I think, what you said is really important, and at the same time, I think it's also, very helpful to recognize that what we're really trying to get to here is just to make sure that all people, here in California can feel safe in whatever environment that they live in, right? All people want to be free from violence, and have opportunities to thrive. I think that's a given that everyone can agree to. But the problem here when it comes to believing that the solution to achieving that freedom, those types of communities is law enforcement, is where we get into a very tricky situation, especially with the degree to which surveillance technologies are being used, right? So I'll put it quite frankly, right? You mentioned a crime wave. Well, the fact is, if you look at the data, it shows that statewide crime rates are at historic lows, relatively speaking. And in addition to that, we know that relying on police and surveillance as a primary method of improving community safety doesn't work. We've tried that for decades, and we continue to see numerous challenges with that. So what I'd like to do is just unpack these two threads a little bit more. So if you wouldn't mind, can we go to the next slide, please? So here, there's a couple of data visuals. I'd like to talk about the first point about the apparent crime wave in California as a justification for the need to have law enforcement and surveillance technologies. So here, if you look at the data visual on the left, the line on the blue at the bottom is the violent crime rate. And if you look at the visual on the right, it's just that same line in blue zoomed in. And if you look at the one on the right, the zoomed in version, you can see where we are versus the peak, right? So we're at a peak in 1992 when it came to violent crime. And right now, with most recent data up to 2023, we're approximately 56% lower than that. And then similarly speaking, when you look at the orange line on the data visual to the left, it shows that the property crime rate is 67% lower than the peak from 1980. So the general notion that, hey, we need more law enforcement, and in turn to build out the use of more surveillance technologies because we're in the middle of a significant crime wave, simply does not pass muster. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I'd also like to offer up the suggestion that, even setting aside whether there's a crime wave or not, what is the best approach to how we actually make communities safer? I think that's a key question, right? So if you look at this data visual here, this one's a little bit more complex, so I'll try to unpack it, just bear with me for a second. But the line going from the top left in blue to the bottom right shows the evolution of what's called clearance rates in California, right? And clearance rates are important because they are an indicator of how effective law enforcement is at doing its purported job. And clearance rate specifically speaks to the relationship between a crime being reported and a crime being solved, i.e. an arrest was made. So if a crime is cleared, i.e. someone reported a crime, arrest was made, or the case was disposed of via some other means. So if you look at this data visual on the far right, the bottom right corner, it shows that the clearance rate up to the most recent available data here is 2022, statewide was at a low of 13%. And in comparison, in 1985, that rate was much higher, 7 points higher actually, at about 20%. So let me put this in context, right? 13% clearance rate, stated differently, means that approximately 87% of the time when a crime is reported, law enforcement agencies fail to arrest the person or the matter is resolved in some other way. For example, the perpetrator died or something like that, right? And at the same time, if you think about that 87% within the context of a public institution where billions of dollars are going towards it, it seems extremely troubling to continue to funnel dollars towards that. So for example, if we had any other type of public institution, think of schools. Say if schools failed 90% of kids, do you think that it would make sense as a member of the public to keep funneling money into that institution? But when it comes to law enforcement, we're getting those sorts of results. Almost 90%, they don't get it right. So, someone is still, it's not resolved. And we're funneling billions of dollars into this institution. And to think about the dollars a little bit more concretely, the second part of the data visual, the gray bars, rising from the bottom left to the top right corner, show per capita spending on law enforcement statewide over time. And you can see from the data visual, we're now at a high of approximately $651 per capita being spent on law enforcement statewide, compared to about $400 in 1985. And now to put that in terms of total dollars that's being spent, it now exceeds over 27 billion annually going towards this institution. So when you think about the amount of money being spent on law enforcement in relationship to the return on investment, like, hey, are they actually preventing the purported crime wave? Are they out there fixing this? It begs the question of, to what end? Like, what's really the purpose of all of this? And if you go to the next slide, please. I'll stop there. Actually, we'll go back. I'll stop there. But the last thing I'll say is, we're talking about the problem of law enforcement, the amount of money going towards it. The other thing that I didn't really speak to is that in addition to the $27 billion annually now going towards these agencies, a significant portion of those funds goes towards surveillance technologies. So that includes fusion centers. They're getting a ton of funds from a variety of governmental sources. But more specifically here in California, we have automated traffic enforcement technology, speed cameras for red lights and trying to catch people speeding. There's body-worn cameras that are being used in ways that give rise to numerous privacy and surveillance implications. There's license plate readers. There's killer robot police dogs. There's so many things. Every year there's another toy. It's like they just keep coming out with these toys, giving them to law enforcement, and then all too often, communities of color, especially people who are low income, are the ones that bear the brunt of the nefarious effects that occur over the course of time. And I think if we really want to move towards addressing issues of crime, violence, and making communities safer, what we really need to do is start to think through ways in which the state and localities can invest more dollars in addressing the root causes of safety risks. And by safety risks, I mean things like housing and economic insecurity. We should be providing better schools, better programs to help people not get involved with the criminal legal system or become engaged in recidivism, social supports for youth. All those sorts of things are better long-term investments than continuing to waste public dollars on things that don't actually make communities safer. So I'll stop there, and then hopefully we can get into some of these issues a little bit more.
Absolutely, thank you, Chauncey. I mean, sort of extraordinary kind of visual here. I mean, I think it puts in stark relief the basic problem here that as we have funded policing in the state of California, the police work has gotten worse. Is essentially the kind of what I'm understanding from this presentation. I mean, I think then it makes you got into the ultimate sort of solution, and that's what I want to ask you all, end with you all here about, which, given these problems, given the prevalence of these technologies, how the data produced from these technologies can be exploited both by intransigent local police departments or nefarious federal cops, what to do? what can folks here in California, whether you're a lay member of the public, whether you are a legislator, whether you work for a legislator's office, what kind of, what can we all do to help protect California from some of these problems and sort of reorient the way we think about solutions to public safety? So maybe I'll start kind of from the end and work my way towards me.
All right. I mean, I think, we've talked a lot about sharing, and I think it is one thing, you asked me to pick a thing, which you have. Sharing, really thinking about sharing and why we do it and how we do it, and whether we should do it is important for me. I think there's a lot of information that's reasonable to collect in like one case, right? Like in the consumer context, the thing I often say is like, if I ask you to deliver me a pizza, I give you my address, and so you can give me the pizza. But I'd be like really upset if you then published my address, especially if I were someone who was like trying to hide from like an abusive partner or an unsupportive parent or something like that, right? So in one context, information can be benign, it can be useful for the thing that you want, and then in another context, it can be incredibly dangerous. And so if we're not thinking carefully about how we share information and who has it and what they are using it for, that's where we run into issues. So for example, just one concrete thing we would love to see is California has a law called the Information Practices Act. It sets privacy guidelines for state agencies, so limits collection, maintenance, and distribution of personal information. It also gives individuals the right to exert some control over their information, so it gives them the right to review information held in state agency records, find out who else has looked at it, and also to request changes to inaccurate or irrelevant information. Those are really crucial protections, really kind of common sense, privacy, hygiene sorts of practices. And that protection does not extend to county or municipal agencies. So as we see, local governments, municipal governments, county governments getting involved in the sort of information sharing, they're not subject to the same standards. And now that I know that there's like standard shopping, that particularly makes me even more concerned, right? So that's a tremendous amount of information if you think about the information that you give to your local governments. And so we'd really love to see privacy protections at that level, to both to standardize and then to update, right? This law is 9 years older than I am, so I'd love to see it updated.
Right.
So I think that there are a number of ways to address this. With 28 CFR Part 23, the federal government tried to change it at one point, and the public commentary was so negative they weren't able to. So that regulation still exists, and to the extent, one of the key parts of it is that even when information does meet the reasonable suspicion of criminal activity standard and can be shared because of that, it can only be shared with another law enforcement agency. And that's a critical protection that's undermined by the fusion centers because they bring non-law enforcement personnel into the room where they share this kind of information. And that is one thing that that instead of allowing these people in a room to find the lowest common denominator, that California can be effective, as it is in other contexts, in making sure everyone plays by a higher standard, by not allowing information to be shared except when it meets this higher standard and one that California law enforcement can control. So that's both ways transmission. As I said, the FBI's standards for what they collect and retain is so much lower now that it would inhibit the FBI's ability to be able to share information that wasn't gathered with the proper tactics, but also and standards, but also that you're not sharing information with non-law enforcement personnel if it's collected for a law enforcement purpose. We've been working with federal agencies, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, to increase surveillance of data brokers. These are notorious private companies that collect all kinds of information from all our devices and everything else. but it's notoriously inaccurate information. There's often errors in it. But more importantly, there's no controls on where it goes. And you know, when these companies are hired by law enforcement, you know, even if it's just what questions law enforcement is asking, they're getting a lot of information, right? And they market that information, not just here in the United States, around the world. So, you know, something collected by a law enforcement agency here in California could be shared not just with the federal government, but other governments around the world. And, you know, certainly that can cause bigger problems. So regulation on what, you know, and again, you know, these are standards, mentioned the ICA, that have existed for a long time because they were protected. And this notion that somehow collecting information without any standard makes us safer has not been documented as we see. You know, if you look at the technological advancements and the expansion of collection authorities on this graph, you would see that we're actually keeping Americans in California less safe. And I will say that these clearance rates for California are mirrored across the country, right? You see the same disparities happening across the country. So the standards, like when I was an agent, they were helpful. You know, it's not the guy I think is scary because I have a bias against the way he looks or the things that he says, but whether I have evidence to believe that he's doing something wrong, and making it an evidence-based standard helps law enforcement be more effective and efficient, so we don't have a graph that looks like this 10 years from now.
Yeah, if I may, I have a little bit more to show you when it comes to thinking about solutions. So Catalyst California is a co-convener of a coalition called Promoting Unity, Safety, and Health in Los Angeles. We go by Push LA. This is a coalition that was formed in 2019 in response to a long history of racially biased policing by LAPD, and especially through a problematic practice known as pretextual stops, which is a pathway to racial profiling. It includes a whole host of organizations that are listed on the slide that we work with, a lot of community-based organizations. And at the heart of this work is really trying to improve the lives of low-income communities of color. And you can see here, there's visuals of 2 young black men who were killed by the Los Angeles Police Department recently. And this coalition has been working to develop some innovative solutions in the city of Los Angeles that I'd like to share with you. So there's 4 key components, and these intersect with the issue of policing and surveillance. But I'll say at a high level, what we're really trying to do is address the problem of being over-policed and under-protected. From my perspective, I think the scope of law enforcement in California is far too broad, and we really need to rein it in. They're responsible for a whole host of activities that they're neither well qualified or best suited to actually carry out. And Push LA has been focused specifically on the issue of traffic safety, so I'll unpack some specifics there. One, the coalition is trying to end the use of pretextual stops by the Los Angeles Police Department. Pretextual stops are when a person is stopped for a relatively low level vehicle administrative or equipment issue, and is used as a pathway to search for more heinous criminal activity. Research shows that it's extremely ineffective and results in numerous harms, and all too often people of color being killed. So we're trying to end that from happening. Another is to prevent economic extraction through the disproportionate issuance of traffic ticket fees and fines to low-income communities of color. And then third, thinking about surveillance, the coalition is heavily advocating for the use of building out preventative street infrastructure, so changing road design to prevent traffic safety risks altogether, and decrease reliance on law enforcement using stops. Research shows that this is one of the most effective traffic safety methods over the course of time. And within this specific context, transforming street infrastructure, there is a tendency for localities throughout the state to think that, okay, if we roll back law enforcement, what should we put in its place? And they tend to think that the silver bullet solution is various forms of technology, such as red light cameras. So instead of having an officer pull someone over and give them a ticket for speeding, you can use a camera. But for a lot of the reasons that were offered up earlier, these sorts of technologies are extremely troubling. So, for example, for low-income communities of color, there's a significant concern about economic extraction continuing to play out in a more nefarious form, although more nebulous, through the use of these technologies. Because from what we've heard, they're probably going to be disproportionately located in areas where there's higher rates of traffic collisions, which tends to geographically overlap where there's higher people of color and people who are low income. In addition to racial bias, there's significant concerns about privacy and these technologies being used to surveil low-income communities of color once they're located there. And then their actual efficacy, because if you think about these surveillance technologies, they're premised upon an idea that punishment, i.e. a ticket, is going to be a long-term effective solution to making communities safer. But people have been getting tickets forever. And if you look at traffic safety outcomes, they're getting worse. So for example, in 2023, there were more motor vehicle collision related fatalities in LA, about 327, than their homicides. So when we talk about community safety, traffic safety goes to the heart of it, and deterrent through punishment has shown to be relatively ineffective. And then lastly, to make communities safer, rather than relying on police and surveillance, we're aiming to build out a workforce of unarmed care-based response to emergency situations, so that every time a situation arises in a community that is a moment of crisis, people need help, we don't have to call a person with a gun that is not well trained to deal with the situation to resolve it. So those are just some things I'd like to offer up, and hopefully the legislature and localities throughout the state can consider these sorts of things instead of the problematic practices that we know we currently have in place.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Chauncey. I mean, I think to me, as I kind of listen to you all talk, I sort of understand the interventions in two categories. You know, you might imagine sort of in sort of legal or policy interventions that address the technology on a tech by tech basis. Let's regulate this technology. Let's ban face recognition. Let's ban drones with guns on them, or whatever it might be. And that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, I'm hearing from you all talk about sort of systems-based approaches that address sort of bigger problems associated with this entire ecosystem. So there was the Information Practices Act that Hayley talked about. There's reforms of the fusion centers, that Mike talked about. There's kind of narrowing the scope of policing in the state of California, not working on pulling law enforcement out of traffic enforcement in some meaningful way that Chauncey described. Some of these other kind of supportive social service sort of interventions that Chauncey's describing. To me, those are the kinds of I guess the universe of interventions that gets us away from this problematic sort of addiction to technology as a solution to our public safety problems is, I think, myriad. And that's what I'm kind of hearing from you all today. I will say one last piece, speaking as somebody working on the ACLU, specifically on the question of fusion centers. In response to a question online, these fusion centers are sites not just of information sharing in general, but also specifically sites where immigration enforcement can utilize the data that's collected from these public and private sources here in California. So that's something that we've commonly seen and we have seen for years. Chauncey talked about traffic enforcement and license plate readers. Early on in the Trump administration, I recall a New York Times expose describing how ICE officials in the state of Washington actually utilized license plate reader data from the state there to actually round up and conduct immigration raids on sort of small communities in the state of Washington. Something that actually happens pretty regularly, all through this like marriage between unsuspecting local law enforcement agencies and federal immigration enforcement. I say that as a sort of warning that I fear that the problems associated with fusion centers in particular are ones that we're going to increasingly hear about. If we don't hear about them now, I guarantee you in about 6 months, perhaps a year, they will be front and center in the sort of American imagination. And that's the reason why we at the ACLU have been for years working and thinking about fusion centers in particular. And I guess my sort of challenge to you all is to sort of be cognizant of their role in the kind of like in law enforcement and immigration enforcement apparatus as we start to see ramped up immigration enforcement in the state of California coming from federal law, from the feds. So I'll leave it there as the sort of our kind of contributions to the conversation. What I might do now is, I know we have a few minutes left for sort of questions. I'll perhaps start with the audience and then turn a little bit to our virtual attendees. If anyone has any questions or thoughts about anything that we've heard about today, I'll start with you in the back, yes.
Sure. Thanks so much for this. Kate Wolf with the Sacramento Bee. Just wondering, Mr. German, if you could say something more about the private entities you were referencing that have access to this information in the fusion centers. What sort of entities?
That's a great question, and I wish I had an answer for you. Each fusion center has their own setup inviting these groups in. My understanding is that some fusion centers allow in a group that the FBI organized called InfraGuard, which includes a lot of local business leaders that they share terrorism intelligence with. And there's no clear understanding of who gets privileged enough to have access to this information, but also what information they're being given. Does it involve their employees? Does it involve people who might be harmed? If you had a business and you learned through something that people who read this particular type of book or this particular type of way of praying, or would you keep those employees on the payroll? If you were a landlord, or you had a bunch of buildings in Sacramento, would you keep those tenants if you got some information and there's no oversight of these things? This wasn't particularly to fusion centers, but when I was, again, with the ACLU in Washington's legislative office, worked with the ACLU of Northern California on a Freedom of Information Act for the FBI, and you may remember this was back in about 2011, 2012, a bunch of very bigoted anti-Muslim counterterrorism training materials that the FBI, the premier law enforcement agency in the country, was teaching and disseminating to state and local law enforcement. During the wildfire season in 2020, I believe it was, there were reports of anti-fascist squads starting the wildfires, and in some areas there were actually law enforcement and in some cases far-right militias setting up roadblocks as people were trying to flee wildfires, trying to catch these mysterious Antifa soldiers that were starting fires, of which of course none of that was true. So it's a lot of disinformation that gets spread with this stuff too. But the real problem is we don't know. And that's, I think, unacceptable in a democratic society.
Other thoughts or questions? One question that did come up was sort of just from the audience online is the extent to which we might be concerned specifically about immigration enforcement in the context of data that's collected for entirely different, separated, unrelated purposes. So I guess for any of you all, Hayley or Mike, if you all have seen that particular problem arise in the past, and what that sort of tells you about what we should be sort of thinking about going forward in this sort of new climate.
again, the activities in the fusion centers are so opaque, and keep in mind that it's not just one particular fusion center, that they exist in a network. So, when I've had the privilege of talking to fusion center leaders, one of the things I've asked of them is, who polices the network? Because if you have a network, the worst actor in that network is the level the network exists at, right? If there's one center that's doing improper things and they're gathering information from your center, you're participating in this abuse. We know Homeland Security is in the fusion centers. We don't have a good idea of exactly what information is being collected, what information is being provided to state and local law enforcement. So it's unfortunately still very opaque.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly things that, back to keeping me up at night, right? If we think about things like automated license plate reader data, which often reveals location, where you go says a lot about who you are, what services you seek, who you hang out with, where you worship, where you go to school. So that's, that kind of information, it sounds like flows pretty freely. I think one problem with fusion centers is that they are quite opaque, as you've been saying, and so it's hard to know specifically, but that is the sort of, again, might be seemingly innocuous information that can really actually reveal a lot about people when applied in these unexpected contexts.
Understood, thank you all. Unless there are any other questions or thoughts? Unless there are any others, then I think what we might do is wrap it up. So I really appreciate the panelists' time and energy in discussing some of these issues. I look forward to working with you all on all of these particular sort of interventions, whether they be at the local level, like with Push LA, or some of the legislative work that Hayley, you described, and indeed some of the federal policy work that I know Mike and his colleagues are working on at the Brennan Center. So with that, I'll close. I thank you all for joining us both in person and virtually, and I look forward to working with you all on these issues in the coming months. Thanks so much.